So last night I had the pleasure of speaking with Hugo Newman, who's a libertarian from Limerick, and his story is very interesting. He was a former mentee of Prof.Gerard Casey here in Ireland, and he now lives in Madrid in Spain. But he became a libertarian from being a socialist. So we explored those ideas. We talked about how socialists recruit and how they use their tactics to keep people in the gang, I suppose. And it was a very interesting conversation, so I hope you enjoy it. So, welcome, Hugo. Thanks for joining me today on Conversations with Rob. It's great to have you
Thanks
here.
very much, Rob. Yeah, it's a pleasure to join you. Yeah, very excited to start the discussion.
Excellent. So, you are one of my favorite libertarians, mentees, Gerard Casey. You went through
Uh-huh.
his course in UCD. Do you want to tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, where do you want me to begin? Do you want me to begin at the very beginning
Well,
or just
what's very interesting with you is that you used to be a card holding socialist,
very much so? Yeah, I literally had a card in my wallet that said I was a member of the Socialist Youth branch in Limerick. Yeah, that's right.
and you
So, well,
jumped ship.
I jumped ship. I did it in a big way. I ran away with my tail between my legs. So, yeah, I can give you a little bit of background on that if you want. So,
Absolutely.
I went to college in Limerick, and before that, I was just completely apolitical. I didn't have any interest in politics at all. I was very cynical about the whole thing. But then, as soon as I started college, I started hearing, this name Noam Chomsky being thrown around a lot by my professors. I was studying philosophy at the time, so I figured I should, find out who this guy was, and so I started reading some of his stuff on politics, and yeah, I found it good. I found it. It was kind of the first time politics seemed pretty kind of have some kind of intellectual depth. It was stimulating, and he seemed kind of morally serious. So I kept reading Chomsky, and then I started kind of seeking out people who thought in a similar way, and I noticed a few posters up around the college from the Socialist Youth branch in Limerick, inviting people to come to various talks and things like that. So I went along to a few of the talks, and then they fairly aggressively recruited me, I would say. They were very, very keen to get me formally involved and to go along to the weekend stalls on O'Connell Street and all that kind of stuff. So I did. I kind of felt like I had a duty or an obligation to kind of join in, because I see at the time I agreed with Chomsky's kind of prescriptions, and I was beginning to kind of get a handle on this anarcho-syndicalism stuff and socialism and all that kind of thing. So I figured, yeah, I better do my bit, and so I went along and started helping out more regularly the stalls and the various events and the meetings and things like that. And eventually they gave me the little card and with my name on it.
What age were you at this stage?
I was I was 19 or 20, I suppose, when I
Right.
started. Yeah, 19, probably 19, I think. Yeah, and spent about 2 years, involved in Limerick, and doing all the stuff, canvassing door to door, leafleting, all that kind of stuff, going to demonstrations, and God, it's kind of embarrassing thinking about it. But anyway, what else did I do? There was these weekly discussion groups actually that they had as well, which we would go along to, and it was a very small circle of people. It was about 7 or 8 people, and young lads, and we would just kind of sit down and discuss the topics of the week, and we would kind of do it all from a socialist point of view. But I remember in particular, there was one guy who I won't name. It gives me the shudders when I think about him. But anyway, he was the leader, or the
Right.
self-appointed leader, or whatever. He was the most experienced, and kind of he had the most knowledge about socialism and stuff like that. So he was kind of leading the group discussions, and I remember he very closely moderated, and monitored what was being said and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, yeah, and yeah.
Was skepticism welcome at those meetings?
In theory, yeah, but the way it was never very welcome when you raised substantial kind of reservations or criticisms. No, I would say that it was it was usually laughed or joked away, or it was kind of swept aside, or fairly superficially engaged with, you know. At least the kind of the serious objections that I kind of began to raise when I started having my first kinds of doubts were fairly readily just thrown aside or dismissed. Yeah. So I can come back to that in a second. But do you want me to tell you the kind of the beginnings of the end?
Yeah, I'm interested to hear how your skepticism of those socialist ideas amounted you to where you are now. Kind of, it's fascinating.
Well, that's it's kind of a long story. My first doubts were kind of about the details actually of socialism. So I mean, I had no doubt about the kind of the justice of equality, and I had no doubt that, you know, we had to help the poor and stop the wars and stop the corruption and all that kind of stuff. That were kind of vague, you know, moral objectives. I was kind of firmly committed to. But the kind of nuts and bolts or day-to-day kind of aspects of how a socialist system would work was always very, very unclear to me. And it was always very kind of it was just this fuzz in my mind about how it actually would work in practice. So some of the questions that I used to have were the kinds of questions along the lines of, well, you know, if you're working in a factory, say, for example, a shoe factory, just to take one example, and there are other shoe factories within the nation, when I vote on, you know, shoe production, for example, do I get to have a say in the policies of one of the other shoe factories, or do I only have a say in the factory? And then, you know, all the other kind of questions about like inter-industry relationships and resources, you know, being shared amongst different industries, and how you would resolve conflicts in those kinds of situations, and so on and so forth. Those kind of just basic kind of practical questions, right? Whenever I raised those kinds of questions, I found they were just instantly dismissed, or they were usually, the usual answer was, well, that would be worked out democratically. Which for me was just a completely ridiculous non-answer, right? Because I mean, the whole point is, well, how do you come to democratic decisions in the first place in this incredibly complex environment where you have, you know, workers within one factory and within another with democratic control? How does the whole structure democratically work? You can't just say, well, we'd work that out democratically. I mean, that just begs the question, right? So I found those kinds of non-answers or kind of evasions very frustrating, but I kind of just kept my silence for the time being. But those were the first doubts that I had were along those lines, you know. But I kind of just trucked on anyway, and I kind of set them to one side and just continued doing my bit.
Right. And in terms of, you know, looking at libertarian ideas, was it when you went to UCD that was the first time you'd encountered ideas like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd never come across libertarian ideas at all, to be honest with you, only to the extent that they were kind of caricatured and dismissed immediately. Liberal, one of my least favorite words in the English language, absolutely just destroyed. If possible to destroy a word, I would destroy that one. But the word neoliberal was the usual one that was kind of buzzword that was thrown around. And, you know, neoliberal could mean everything and anything that was, you know, part of the status quo. But I think maybe the only name I would have heard was maybe Milton Friedman. In terms of tellingly, we never actually read any of this stuff in our discussion groups, for example. So there was never a time where we, you know, prescribed a reading, for example, for the week of one of our ideological opponents. It just didn't happen, right? And for me, looking back now, that should have been a kind of a major sign or a clue that there was something a little bit wrong with it. You know, I mean, it seems to me one of the basics of any kind of, or one of the basic responsibilities of any person who subscribes to an ideology is to at least consider the arguments from the other side and to look at them and to see whether or not there's any merit in them, you know. So that was just something that never ever happened. Now, I mean, I don't think that's necessarily exclusive to socialism. Of course, there are, you know, I mean, other ideologies, people in other political movements have those problems, but that was one kind of indication there was something a little bit suspect going on.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, my first interaction with libertarianism wasn't until I went to UCD. Now, I was absolutely delighted, actually, when I got to go to UCD, because it was around that time, which is when I was, say, 22, when I finished my degree, that I was really beginning to tire of the socialist stuff, right? I mean, you know, I mean, I had my theoretical kind of reservations, but you know, it was the actual work which I just could not stand. I just found it really, really repulsive and draining and just not for me at all. Like doing all this canvassing and demonstrating and putting your fist in the air and, you know, chanting through speakers and all that kind of stuff. And I just, it was just terrible. I just hated it. So that was the real thing that I just didn't feel comfortable, was the kind of revolutionary posturing that was going on, right? It just wasn't for me. And so I was looking for a kind of an escape in some ways from the actual practical side of things, like the actual activism stuff. I just needed to get out. And the truth is, I mean, they would harangue you and they would really chase you down when you would just like not turn up at events and stuff. You know, it was quite sinister actually in many ways looking back on it, because I remember, you know, you're a young lad, right? I mean, you're just a young lad in college, and you know, on Saturdays they would have their stalls, and there was the occasional Saturday where I would just, you know, I would sleep in, or I'd been drinking the night before. I just wouldn't really be, you know, I wouldn't really be up for it or whatever, right? You wouldn't be in the mood for going out and marching and demonstrating and stuff like that. But I remember always, without exception, anytime I missed a stall or an event, this particular guy who I mentioned before would instantly just call you, like would call you up on your house phone and go, you know, I noticed you weren't there now earlier on, you know, and you know, that's a real shame, like, you know, that's twice now in a row that you've missed the stall, like, and you know, it's kind of, you're kind of letting down the others who come along and, you know, really put their bit, you know, pull their weight, and you're not really pulling your weight. And there was this kind of
giving you peer pressure.
Yeah, there was a lot of that going on, you know, but there was this kind of sense that, you know, my personal kind of life and my kind of, you know, that all was secondary, you know, it really was, that I had to just set that aside, right? When it came to the socialist stuff, this is where it is, and this is what you need to prioritize.
The revolution is all that matters.
Yeah, and if you're not prioritizing that, then you're not part of the team, you know.
Wow.
So that was the real. I definitely got that. I kind of felt that pretty heavily, and I just wanted to get the hell out of that atmosphere, to be honest with you. So that's when I went to Dublin. I applied for a master's in UCD, and I got it, and away I ran. Pretty delighted to get away from that kind of stuff, and. But I still had kind of notions of us, you know, being a socialist intellectual or whatever, you know, just that was my goal, was to be the next Chomsky or whatever, right? So so I was still very much a socialist when I went to UCD. I wasn't.
So in a sense, there was a crusade to sort of take Casey down and his ideas down. Did you go into the class?
You could say that, yeah. I mean, so when I arrived in UCD and I was looking at the different modules that were available, I noticed this one, which is called Law, Liberty in the State by Gerard Casey. And of course, you know, you're talking with your classmates, and a few of them were from UCD, so they knew who he was. So I heard his name being kind of mentioned as this crazy radical, neoliberal, right wing, blah 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 blah, right? You know, this kind of conservative, crazy, blah. So I looked at the course description, and it was kind of, I was a little bit intrigued and interested, but also mostly I was just kind of thinking, right, well, I can go in and just, you know, this guy needs to be put in his place, right? I mean, this guy is just spreading right-wing propaganda to poor, vulnerable master students. So I kind of had these notions about going in and kind of arguing back and pushing back against these ideas, and I could throw my Chomsky at him and he would have no response, right? So that was the beginning, right? So I signed up and I started this module. And well, I mean, it was an incredible experience, because I was completely silent from start to finish when I took his course. You know Gerard Casey yourself. I mean, he's an incredible teacher. He's a really, really good method of teaching, and he invites just a really kind of collaborative, interactive approach, and he's not kind of lecturing at you, especially in this kind of in the master's module especially. I mean, it's a very open discussion, but he kind of just leads it. And there was a core text, obviously, which was Murray Rothbard's The Ethics of Liberty. And we went through that throughout the course with other supplementary readings. But, you know, he was always inviting objections and criticisms from students. And I mean, I'm kind of a shy person by nature, right, by disposition. So I didn't really say anything for the first few classes, but I was kind of waiting for my moment, right? But the moment never came, because he preempted every single one of my objections and criticisms. So as other students kind of raised objections that I might have considered raising, he just completely destroyed them and dismantled them one by one. And I just found myself, as we went through, I could just feel the kind of ideological structure just crumbling inside me in my brain, and just I was in complete disarray by the end of the course, right? I mean, I was just, all of my assumptions had been just completely overturned, and I was questioning everything that I had already assumed, and as any good philosophical module should do, right? And this one, more so than any other I've ever taken, just completely obliterated my political assumptions. So it was an equal part stimulating and traumatizing experience, I would say. But you know, it was just one of those things where I just could not stop thinking about it, right? I mean, it was one of those intellectual awakenings, I suppose. But I don't want to sound too pretentious, but that's genuinely how it felt, right? I mean, I just could not stop thinking about this stuff 24/7. Always thinking about it. And I started reading Rothbard, started reading his other works, I started reading Mises, I started reading a little bit of Hayek, I started reading all these other guys. And my kind of first port of call was Mises.org, right, which is an incredible online resource at the time. It was one of the best for sure. A huge amount of free materials and PDF books and things like that, and articles. So everything I needed was there. And I just read voraciously on that for during my master's year. And in part, I think it was partly looking for a hole in the arguments and kind of, there must be something wrong here, right? There's definitely something I'm missing. And then part of it was also just that I genuinely found it compelling, right? I mean, there was something attractive about it. There was something intellectually nice, aesthetic about it. You know, the logic of it was so simple without being simplistic, right? It was explanatorily powerful. It was elegant. It was, you know, just these kind of two basic rights and principles that you have: self-ownership rights, private property rights. And then it's like, you know, in some ways it's like an intellectual game trying to resolve social problems and potential questions by applying these principles and seeing where it takes you, you know.
Yeah. So
that was part of it as well, part of the fascination for me, at least. But I remember as well, you know, there were other students who were just, I mean, they completely disagreed with Casey, and they did not have the same kind of traumatic experience that I had. You know, they kind of they just kind of decided, I suppose, that, you know, even though what he was saying maybe it was coherent and consistent, that it was just wrong, the wrong kind of conclusion. So they decided not to listen or whatever. But even those people agreed that there was just something about it, about the kind of the theory, that was really addictive. You know, I mean, they said, even I remember there was one girl who was just completely left wing, right? She was just, you know, she was complete lefty, and but she was an exchange student. But I remember she said to me one day, she's like, I you know, I completely disagree, but I just can't stop thinking about this stuff. Like, I cannot stop thinking about libertarianism and thinking what a libertarian would say in this situation, how they would answer this question. She said, I was cycling to university one day and I nearly crashed my bike because I was just thinking about libertarianism. She said, I was just like, you know, so I mean, there's something about it that just has that kind of intellectual fascination or something. Which for me is just, but anyway, it's just one aspect of the many great things about libertarianism. So that's how it began. That's how it began, right?
Excellent. So you must have a really interesting perspective. Casey spoke at our regional conference in November, and he talked about this idea of libertarian flashing. And we've all done it. Like we've all said, no, this is the right way. No, this is the right reason. No, this is the best way to have society.
Right. Okay.
And he describes that as libertarian flashing.
Now, when you say flashing, I'm not familiar with it. He didn't use that when I was studying under him. I never heard him say libertarian flashing. But let me think now. What does he mean by that? Is that flashing in the sense of just exposing yourself in public, right?
Exposing your ideas in public to people who mightn't necessarily opt in.
Okay, I like that. That's good. Libertarian flashing. Right, so just exposing your ideas in the most crude and crass way possible, right?
Exactly. So you must have a really good perspective on how to convince socialists of these ideas now.
Well, it's kind of funny because I've never actually, I'd like to think that I do. I've never actually put it to the test, right? Because I've never had socialists actually come to me and say, you know, what's your thoughts on this, you know, or, you know, what's this libertarianism all about, or, you know, most of them just hear I'm a libertarian and run a mile, right? I mean, there have been some exceptions. I can't say I've had any successes in terms of actually, you know, what's the word, converting anyone. You know,
Mm.
I don't think well, actually, no, I do have one friend. I've one old friend actually who I went to secondary school with, who was, and I remember it was about 3 years ago, and you know, I meet him. He lives in Limerick, and I used to live in Dublin, so I wouldn't see him very frequently. But every Christmas when I go back to Limerick, and I'd meet up with this guy and talk with him, and he'd always grill me about libertarianism, and usually it was kind of fairly, you know, disparaging and whatever, and he would dismiss it as, you know, lunacy and crazy and all that kind of stuff. And he was kind of left-leaning, I would say, not exactly leftist or socialist, but left-leaning, certainly at the time. So that was 3-4 years ago. But every Christmas I go back and we'd have a long kind of discussion, and I would lay out my ideas, and I tried to be as kind of, you know, as how would you say, tactful as I could be, right? And try to follow my own rules that I'd kind of internalized when it comes to trying to convincing people. Yeah, he actually got in touch with me recently, about 6 months ago, and he just sent me a message on Facebook. He just goes, "I'm a libertarian now." It's just like, what? Yeah, he's like, "Yeah, I'm a libertarian," you know, and just I couldn't believe it.
You planted those seeds.
I mean, I'd like to take credit. I mean, who knows? There was probably other reasons, and I never actually asked him if it was my kind of what I had said to him that planted the seeds, as you said. But I'd like to think I had some part in that, you know.
Yeah, of course.
So that's one success story, I suppose you could say. But apart from that, I haven't really been able to put it to the test. But I do. Here's how I approach it, Rob. Right? I mean, here's the way I look at it: is I think back to how I was when I was a socialist. Mm. And I know the kinds of things that I hated to hear when it came to criticisms of socialism, right? I know the kinds of arguments that I just instantly thought, I shut down when I heard them, right? And they were kind of very typical arguments that you would hear often from people who were on the right, or kind of broadly speaking conservative or libertarian or whatever. And it's kind of with that in mind that I feel like I have at least some insight into how we should be talking to socialists, because I know how I would want to have been spoken to when I was a socialist, right?
Interesting.
If someone came to me with a different point of view, there's certain things that I just would not want to hear, and there's other things that I would have been open to listening to, right? And so it's kind of, when I imagine myself arguing with my former self, that's how I kind of gain insights into how I think libertarians should be speaking and engaging with socialists. So, you know, I don't think I have any kind of insight in the sense that I can't point any successful instances of me convincing a socialist. But
so what type of a thing would have been, you know, could we use the word triggering? What type of thing would you have heard like that? Like I've a few things in my mind, like maybe we would like to privatize the XYZ. You know, take the water, Irish water. You know, obviously a lot of people felt irked over the Irish water thing in Ireland because it was being, quote, privatized, and it wasn't really. It was just giving it to a Irish water, the companies, basically a public monopoly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, is it that type of thing that?
Well, no, I mean, no, it's more along the lines of, it's not necessarily people who would have been trying to convert me to something, because I never met a libertarian when I was a socialist. So I mean, there was never a case where someone came to me trying to convince me to become an X, a Y, or a Z, right? It was mostly just people who were kind of maybe kind of either apolitical or kind of center, kind of, or, you know, just skeptical about socialism, but without any kind of coherent ideology themselves. But even those people would kind of tend to kind of regurgitate the kind of the kind of more superficial criticisms that you would get from the right and from the conservative and libertarian side sometimes. So what I'm speaking about more is the criticisms of socialism that would instantly cause me to shut off, right?
Okay.
So that's the kind of thing that I kind of find frustrating sometimes when I speak with other libertarians, or when I look at other libertarians critiquing and criticizing socialism, is that, you know, I often find that they just they resort to the same kind of how would you say, cliched criticisms of socialism. So, for example, I can give you some examples to make this more concrete. One of the common criticisms would be that socialists want government control of the means of production, right? Now, I mean, that might seem innocent enough, and to a libertarian, that sounds about right, okay? I mean, and in some sense, I think it is actually a correct definition of socialism, is government or state ownership and control of the means of production. But the problem is, for a socialist, when they hear that, they think, well, that's not what we have in mind at all, right? If you're talking about the current state and government that we are familiar with today, simply taking over the reins of industry and the economy, then that's not what socialists have in mind, right? Now, right or wrong, that's how socialists think, right? So they think, no, we're talking about a radically different form of government and a radically different kind of state. So we're not talking about the typical politicians that you're familiar with being in control of industry. We're talking about, workers democratically electing from within their own ranks, representatives who will go up through the levels, and eventually they'll all be answerable to the workers themselves. And you have the central council or committee of kind of workers' peers, basically. And that's the sense in which they mean government control of the means of production. Right. And that's the sense in which I would have meant government control of means of production back in the day, right? So that's just one example. It might seem trivial or kind of nitpicking, but I think it's actually very, very important that those little linguistic linguistic nuances can make a huge amount of difference when you're engaging with a socialist, because you end up arguing at cross purposes, right? You're just, you have one thing in mind, or they think you have one thing in mind, and they have another thing in mind, and it's just, you never really get going, right?
Yeah, because nobody's defined what the terms actually mean.
Yeah, exactly. So what I would, here's my first kind of recommendation for libertarians when they're arguing with socialists is, you have to try and meet them on their own terms, right? You start where they are. So you say, right, and you don't lose anything by doing this, okay? So what I would do if I was speaking with a socialist now is I would say, okay, well, what's your vision of socialism, right? I mean, tell me what it is. Okay, so allow them to spell it out, right? And they will probably give you something along the lines of, well, what I have in mind is worker control of industry, and the workers then would be democratically in control of their workplace, and they would elect from within the workplace a representative who would then go up to the kind of regional level, and there would be inter-industrial coordination at that level amongst the representatives. And then they would elect from within their own ranks to the next most the national level or whatever, and then upwards, and on and on and on, right? And the central committee then is the socialist kind of workers' state or government, right? And it's a government in that sense, right? So I would say, okay, let's allow that's what you have in mind, and that's the kind of the ideal, and that's what we want to work towards. And it's then you start pointing out the problems, okay? So you say, well, okay, here's, there's many problems with it, right? But one of the problems is, you could say, well, look at, public choice theory. If you're familiar with public choice theory, and one of the major insights is that it's rational for voters to be ignorant when it comes to elections at a national scale, especially. So that the larger the number of voters, the less power individually each person's vote has, the less chances it has of making a difference in any given election. And so the incentive to inform oneself is very, very low, because it's just irrational to do so, right? So that particular dynamic and that kind of rationale applies equally within the socialist system as it does in the current kind of liberal democracy that we're familiar with today. So that's just one example of how I would kind of begin to argue with the socialists, is just grant them their ideal vision. But what I find most libertarians tend to do is they say, oh, that's just stupid, or that's just idealistic, right? I mean, you can't have that. It's just, it's just wishful thinking, right? What you're going to have is you're going to have a bureaucracy, and you're going to have a government with politicians that we're familiar with, and they're the ones who are going to be running our lives, right? And again, the socialists will just jump the boat then, and you're just not really engaged anymore, right? So that's kind of one of my recommendations, is you got to go as far as possible onto their terms. And you don't need to be worried about doing that, because you can still use real solid knockdown arguments against them, even on those terms, right?
Yeah.
So that's just one way of doing it.
Yeah. So my experience with some socialists or left-leaning people has been, like, if we take the example of Venezuela recently, you offer a media hit, and they'll say, no, that's just US propaganda. That's not real. That's not really what's going on. The imperialist US is in there meddling, and they won't engage. So that's kind of frustrating. How can you get them to sort of engage in the reality of what's going on? Like, I interviewed recently a guy from Venezuela, and he's also a libertarian, and he obviously talks that, Chavez and Maduro's policies are destroying the country, and socialism is is a ruinous ideology. Like when you break it down.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Well, I mean, the Venezuela one, I mean, this is always tricky, right? Because, I mean, the socialist plays the same card over and over again, right? Which is, that's not real socialism, okay? We're all familiar with this refrain, and I used to do this myself when I was a socialist, right? You know, someone would point to Russia or Cuba or North Korea or whatever, you know, socialist country. And you know, the answer is always, well, that's not real socialism, right? That's been, you know, co-opted by a dictatorship and it's not, you know, blah, 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 right? Well, there's a number of ways you can deal with that. It's a difficult one to deal with, though, and that's why I actually prefer to get socialists on theoretical ground, because that's where they tend to actually are most vulnerable, right? Because you can always, the problem with playing the kind of empirical or historical game is that you can just go down a rabbit hole, and you're going to be saying, like, you're going to start out. So, for example, if you say, well, Russia was really a socialist country, right? It was a real socialist country, and that's what it leads to: dictatorship, mass murder, mass imprisonment, and so on. And the socialists will say, well, no, that's not true, because, you know, I mean, the revolution was good and, you know, everything was going well until, you know, the early 20s. And then there was the war, and that caused, you know, a lot of problems economically. And it was really just the fact that there was a war. It kind of disrupted the situation. They couldn't make the transition. And Russia was too backwards before the revolution and blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't economically well developed enough and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, you can go on and on and on like that, because then you're just getting into historical facts, right? You're going to be talking about what Stalin did in 1920, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, you never win that argument, okay? You're going to have to go to a library with the person and just kind of go, right, well, let's sit down and look through the facts. What I prefer to do is just avoid that entirely, right? Just try to avoid that game, because you're probably going to lose anyway, right? Because they've got all their, you know, their preferred history books that cast everything in a favorable light for socialism. So you're never going to really win that argument. Probably the best thing to do, I think, is to try and get them on theoretical ground and say, well, okay, let's look at what this actually involves, right? And what are the incentives going to be like for a person in the situation? Let's really try and imagine what you would do in the situation. You know, if you're a worker in a factory and, you know, you have to vote on a national plan and your vote doesn't really actually count for anything, and are you going to spend a huge amount of time and effort informing yourself when you've got to worry about actually producing the stuff? And, you know, I mean, you're going to be spending your time actually working as well, and blah, blah, blah. So that's the way I like to go. And then what if you can sow any seeds of doubt in that theoretical domain, that makes it easier then to make the case, the kind of empirical case, right? Because you can go, well, look, these are the dynamics. These are precisely the dynamics that have led to the catastrophic situation in Venezuela, right? It's not just because Maduro is incompetent, right? It's not just because Maduro, you know, has dreams about talking to birds and stuff, and that they tell him what Chavez would have wanted. It's like, clearly Maduro's he's a crackpot, right? Okay, so it's easy for the socialists then to say, well, it's just because Chavez gave the reins to Maduro, and it turns out Maduro is just a bit of an incompetent. He doesn't really know what he's doing, right? And they can kind of get off the leash, right? They can get off the hook that way, right? So it's at that point you need some theoretical, you need something more robust. And you need to say, well, no, actually, let's go back and apply this theory and say, see, you can see the dynamics were already in play under Chavez. And it was, the seeds of ruin were already sown under Chavez. And these internal dynamics were just playing out. And they continued to play out under Maduro. And Maduro just tried in desperate ways to tweak the system and to reform it in order to kind of avoid these catastrophic outcomes. And he just made things worse, of course, as is always the case. So that's kind of how I approach these questions. Is I try to avoid getting bogged down first in the historical and empirical stuff, and I shift to the kind of the theoretical stuff first, right? And then we go back and try to apply it and say, look, here is a plausible explanation of what happened in Venezuela that doesn't require talking about the fact that Maduro is incompetent and resting it all on just one person, right? Another way to approach this is to say, well, look, okay, let's grant for the sake of argument that, you know, the USSR was not really socialist, okay? Even though I think that's incorrect, right? I think it was really socialist, and it was absolutely an inevitable result of socialism that a dictator came to power and that you had a kind of a violent bureaucracy take hold. But let's assume it is the case that the USSR was not really a socialist country. But then what you have to do is you have to say to them, you say to the socialists, okay, how do you explain the fact that every nominally socialist country throughout the 20th century, every socialist country that claimed to be a socialist country, and that initially tried to seriously and sincerely implement socialism, ended up in exactly the same situation as the USSR. Mass murder, mass imprisonment, a dictatorship, totalitarianism, economic stagnation, ultimately economic ruin. How do you explain the fact that you have that consistent pattern, right? And you say there's a burden of proof on you there, right? The burden of proof is not on me, okay? It's on you as a socialist to explain away every single one of those instances as being the result of some extrinsic or external factor, right? Some historical accident which caused this particular attempt to implement socialism to go awry. And are you seriously telling me that in these dozens of cases throughout the 20th century, in every one of those cases, it was just some historical accident that derailed socialism? Is it not more plausible, you say to them, is it not more plausible that actually it's some consistent internal dynamic which is pushing these countries towards the economic and political ruin that we see time and time again? So that's two ways I would kind of sow seeds of doubt. That doesn't require you to get bogged down in the kind of historical details and the nitty gritty and the kind of back and forth where you're saying Stalin did this and you're saying no, Stalin didn't do that, and you know, you don't want to go down that road
because right? It's just you're creating an enemy of the other. Then yeah,
exactly. And I mean, you're just going to be saying, well, these are the facts that I'm familiar with, and the other person is going to say, well, these are the facts that I'm familiar with, and it's like you're not really going to get anywhere. It's better if you can try and find some common theoretical ground. It's not easy, of course. I'm not saying it's easy, but the best thing to do, as I said, is to grant them as much as possible and see, okay, this is your ideal vision, and you know, this is what would happen. You think, right? Let's play this out. Let's play through the logic of the system and see where it brings us and see where we end up. And if you can show that that the emergence of a dictatorship from within a socialist system is inevitable and it's just necessitated by the incentives that obtain, then you might have a chance of actually really giving them some cause for doubt and something to think about.